just a minute. If anybody wants to move their chair to be at a different angle, feel free. I know you can see there and there, but if you want to be kind of more in front of the big screen, feel free. And if anyone else comes in, we'll just have them sign in when they come in. But thank you, everybody, for being here. We are from Barrett Planning Group. We're working with the County Department of Human Services on what's called the Home ARP Allocation Plan, which is what we will be telling you about this evening. So first, we're just going to talk about who the team is for this project. It's in part us at Barrett Planning and in large part the county. And giving an overview of the project and eligible activities. We are going to talk a little bit about some highlights for the needs assessment that we've begun working on to give you some kind of data, a snapshot of the information we've been looking at. And then we'll talk about kind of the general project status, where we see ourselves going in the next few months, and then open it up to Q&A. And then at the end, we will just wrap up and give you next steps. So from the county, we're primarily working with Renee Hammond. She's the home program manager. Although we also have Joe. Do you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. Joe Pacheco, Director of Human Services for the county.
Thank you for being here, Joe. And then, like I said, Fiona and me from Barrett Planning Group. I'm Alexis Lanzalotta, Fiona Coughlin. And we're also working with Judy Barrett, our firm's principal, who's not here this evening, but working closely alongside us with this project. And we just want to say a big thank you to Falmouth Town staff for helping us organize this event. So we're going to give you a brief overview of the Home ARP program. If some of you we've spoken with during some kind of smaller consultation interviews, this may already be familiar to you. We'll try to keep it concise. But in a nutshell, Home ARP 101. So the Home ARP program was approved under the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And so what that essentially did was it allocated $5 billion for home participating jurisdictions. You're going to hear me refer to them as PJs quite a bit, to invest in housing and assistance for people experiencing homelessness and other vulnerable populations. So Home ARP, essentially it's designed to strengthen efforts to prevent and end homelessness. So the ARP comes from American Rescue Plan, and the home is because it's those home participating jurisdictions, of which Barnstable County is a home participating jurisdiction. So that's why it has that kind of hybrid name you see there. So these aren't to be confused with other ARPA funds you may have heard about at the county level. These are specifically targeted toward homelessness efforts. So when paired with other resources, Home ARP allows communities to invest in the long-term capacity of housing and homeless systems. So we're going to talk about the eligible activities that you can fund with Home ARP funds, and you'll see quite in large part it's focused on creating infrastructure. So jurisdictions that qualified for home allocation in 2021, they're receiving these Home ARP funds based upon the same home grant formula. So that's how it was determined that Barnstable County would be receiving these funds. So the county allocation is just over $1.5 million, available to all 15 Barnstable County communities, and the county is the lead entity. So the purpose of this plan is really to determine how that funding will be used across a series of eligible activities. And the county does not receive the funds until this allocation plan that we're working on is complete. So our approach to engagement throughout this process, we're really trying to focus on these kind of three values here. Equity, of course, to ensure that individuals who may have fewer opportunities to access housing resources, they can benefit from safe, consistent programs meeting their needs. Community connectivity. A big part of Home ARP is trying to leverage other existing programs and resources and funding sources. So we really want to foster coordination and cooperation among organizations that are already doing this work, helping people experiencing housing scarcity or instability. And then lastly, and I would say most importantly, when we're talking about the populations that these funds are intended to serve, respect and discretion. So identifying, understanding, and addressing the needs of those who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness without compromising their privacy and safety and autonomy. So the plan elements that I'm about to describe, I'm not going to talk about all 7 of these. When we say plan elements, we're talking about the allocation plan that we are drafting. So I'm really just going to talk primarily about the first 3 you see there, because that's really the meat of the plan. The plan starts with talking about the consultation and public participation process that the county undertakes to get the information we need to be able to decide how the funds can best be utilized. And then in terms of kind of the data-heavy side, we're working on a needs assessment and gaps analysis to look at where are the needs among what are called qualifying populations. I'll define, who that's referring to soon. And an analysis of any gaps for serving those qualifying populations. And then I think the really big one that people will be very interested in is the kind of end result. How does the county propose to use these funds across eligible activities? So the plan will allocate a percentage of the eligible activities. It can range from 0 up to the percentage that the county thinks should be, the funds should go toward. So if one of the eligible activities is affordable rental housing, and so if the county chooses to use the funds toward that number 4, production goals, that's what that is referring to. How many units is the plan foreseeing could be created with these home ARP funds? So there are, if you want to learn so much more about this, the project page that we have kind of goes into a little more detail. But the real resource here is HUD's CPD 2110 notice, which we are happy to share with you. I see people have provided their email addresses, so we'll be following up after this meeting. But that's the HUD document that really provides all the information about all of these requirements. So one of the things that we are required to do for this process is to consult with a variety of agencies that serve the needs of qualifying populations. And again, I know you might be waiting to see who that is that I keep talking about. But the agencies that we have to consult with that we've been working on heavily over the last several weeks, the continuums of care. So Cape Cod and Islands Continuum of Care is who that would be referring to. Homeless and domestic violence service providers, public housing agencies, public agencies that address the needs of qualifying populations, public and private organizations that address civil rights and fair housing, and organizations that address the needs of people with disabilities. There's a lot of overlap between those, so it's not kind of like they're each their own distinct thing. There's a lot of agencies that you may have heard of that we've been consulting with do many of those things all at once. One of the interesting things that's not a HUD requirement is consulting with the qualifying populations themselves, which we are still striving to do throughout this process, working with service providers to figure out how we can best get input from the people for these funds are intended to serve. So the qualifying populations that you've heard me talk about, I'll be going into a little more detail about what each of these means when I go over the needs assessment highlights. So the qualifying populations are people who are currently homeless, people who are at risk of homelessness, people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking as defined by HUD. And then other populations where providing services under the Home ARP program would prevent the household's homelessness or would serve those at greatest risk of housing instability. So we'll talk about who kind of all those other groups are. Veterans and veteran family members are also eligible for as a qualifying population, but only if they meet one of these other groups. So those are the qualifying populations, and now you may be wondering, okay, well, what are the activities that these funds can go toward? It's so very specific, and it's, I know, a challenging conversation because the Cape has so many unique housing challenges already, but these funds aren't going to address all of the Cape's housing challenges. It's very targeted specifically toward preventing homelessness. So the eligible activities are rental housing. I'll talk in a little more detail about what that means in a moment. Tenant-based rental assistance and supportive services, the creation of non-congregate shelters, and then operating assistance and capacity building for nonprofits who work with those qualifying populations. And that can only be 10% total of the grant. You can do 5% toward operating assistance and 5% toward capacity building, but that one has a limit. The other 4 do not have a limit as to how much of the grant can be allocated toward it. The last one, admin and planning, that's really for the creation of this plan and for the county to be able to administer the funds. So that's not really a bucket that is we're going to get into too much. But for the rental housing, it can be a variety of rental housing types. So it can be, you know, for transitional housing, it can be for more permanent housing and group housing. So it's a variety of rental housing types can be used with those funds. 70% of the units that are funded with Hallmark funds have to be for those qualifying populations, though. The remaining 30% can be for LMI households. So none of these units are intended to be market rate. They're really meant to serve people who are vulnerable toward housing scarcity. So again, that's at least 70% have to be for the qualifying populations. You could do 100% if you wanted, but then the remaining 30 or less can go towards LMI, which means low to moderate income households. So the supportive services, that one I also wanted to touch on a little bit. There are three kind of categories that HUD talks about for those. There's McKinney-Vento funds, which primarily relate to the education of homeless youth in the public school system, other homelessness prevention services. So that ranges from things like child care, job training and readiness, food assistance, a variety of services that HUD delineates in that CDP notice I talked about. The non-congregate shelters, another interesting one I wanted to point out because it's very specific. Non-congregate meaning that households are individuals or larger households. They have kind of their own space in it, their own private space in it, rather than just kind of an open bed setting. Because the American Rescue Plan is really intended to kind of learn from the experience of COVID. So creating shelters where people can be a bit more spaced out is the intention there. Okay, so we talked about the qualifying populations and the eligible activities. Again, when we follow up with you, if you want to look at more detail, we have exciting fact sheets provided by HUD that kind of go into all of those eligible activities a little more. So we'll share those with you if you want to learn more. But we wanted to talk to you a bit about the needs assessment highlights in the context of each of those qualifying populations. So that first bucket, that first qualifying population we talked about are people who are currently experiencing homelessness. And the way that's defined is it's an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, or an individual or family who will imminently lose their primary nighttime residence. I believe in the notice it's defined as, you know, within 14 days or something. And then the third category is unaccompanied youth under 25 or families with children and youth who may not qualify as homeless under those definitions, but they qualify under some other federal programs specifically relating to youth homelessness. So those are the three categories of people who are currently experiencing homelessness who would be eligible for assistance with these funds. Sure.
If somebody's sleeping couch to homeless or not?
Yes.
They
Homeless.
are under that definition?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there a time frame on that, like doing that for 3 months?
So that's a great question, and honestly, I would have to look at our fact sheets for there's so many specific numbers in all of these, and I know there is a stipulation about moving, you know, 2 or more times within 60 days, and, you know, so they have all sorts of guiding numbers behind all of those. So I can't answer that right now, but I would be happy to follow up with that. But yes, so that's often referred to as like doubling up if 2 households or someone's doubling up with another family or couch surfing as people call it. So yes, that does count. So in terms of the current needs for homelessness, one of the primary data sources we're relying on is what's called the point in time count. And it's really underrepresentative of what the actual state of homelessness is going to be. So what we have in this chart here are the point-in-time counts as they get reported to HUD by the Cape Cod and Islands Continuum of Care. And so this includes people who are both considered sheltered homeless, so they might be in a shelter, they might be in a domestic violence shelter, they could be using an emergency shelter motel voucher, people in transitional housing. And so that's who is counted in this PIT count. So you can see 2022 is on the furthest side of the chart. The PIT count, there were 305 homeless adults, 91 dependent children who were homeless. However, we know that's undercounting because the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education also provides numbers about the homeless youth. Because of those McKinney-Vento funds I mentioned, districts report the number of homeless students they have. And so for the 2021 to 2022 academic year, for Barnstable County, there were 339 homeless students enrolled in the public schools within Barnstable County. And that's up from 255 the previous year. We couldn't get data prior to that. The Department of Education just didn't have it available at the specific district level. But that's, quite a jump and obviously quite a difference from what you see in that point in time count.
That's as identified by the.
Yes, yes. The other reason why there also might be a discrepancy, just to keep in mind, is some of those children who are currently enrolled in the schools, they may actually be in a shelter outside of the Cape. They can still receive transportation to the school at which they were enrolled before they became homeless. So that is another reason why the number might be higher. So looking a little bit more at that qualifying population of people who are currently experiencing homelessness, the tricky part here is that Cape Cod and Islands COC includes Dukes County, it includes Nantucket, so that PIT count does include those other communities as well, and we can break it down a little bit by just looking at Barnstable County. That's pretty important because these funds are actually only for Barnstable County, because it's the Barnstable County Home Consortium that is responsible for allocating the funds within the consortium. That doesn't mean Dukes County or Nantucket, they're not eligible for home ARP funds. So basically communities that are not part of a home participating jurisdiction can apply for state funds as well. So there's a larger bucket that other communities can apply toward. So that's important to keep in mind because almost 10% of the numbers in that PIT count were from Dukes County or Nantucket, but they were only either in transitional housing, using a motel voucher, or unsheltered. They weren't in part of the shelter count because the shelters are within Barnstable County. So the pie chart there, I know it's a little small to see, but the largest share in terms of the numbers of individuals experiencing homelessness are currently housed in family emergency shelters. So you can see there, ES stands for emergency shelter. So there's a percentage in they're an emergency shelter, in a motel. There's vouchers that can assist people currently experiencing homelessness, but that 35% are currently in family shelters. Because you're going to have, parents and their children, so that's going to make the number increase. And then there is 7% in that PIT count were currently unsheltered. So I know it's so small on the screen, but I wanted to show you how that PIT count breaks down just so you can see what we're seeing. It's broken down into what's called their sleeping location, which is either a motel voucher, emergency shelter for families, an emergency shelter for individuals, transitional housing, unsheltered or domestic violence shelters. And it gets broken down by town with the exception of the domestic violence shelters. That is kept confidential. And you can see the number of individuals by town. So, no surprise because this is where the individual shelter is, but Hyannis, Barnstable has the highest in terms of numbers of homeless. So the next population I wanted to talk about at risk of homelessness. So the definition there, again, all of these, I know I have a lot of ands and ors there and it gets a little confusing, but I just wanted to give you a very broad overview of who this is talking about. If you look at that notice from HUD, each one of these bullets has its own bullets underneath it. And, so I just tried to pull out really the overarching points here. But people or households who are at risk of homelessness, it's an individual or a family who has an annual income that's below 30% of the area median income as determined by HUD. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. And there has to be an and there. It's not enough just to have that very extremely low income. There has to be limited support systems for that household. And then there's other program requirements, things like being in a situation where there's overcrowding or having moved 2 times in a period of 60 days and numerous other potential things. And that sublist is or. You need to meet one of those. And then the other at risk of homelessness, again, is a child or youth who does not qualify as homeless according to Hallmark, but they qualify as homeless under other federal programs. They are considered at risk of homelessness. So we just wanted to give some context. The reason why we're looking at 2019 instead of the current area median income is because the most recent data we have available to us for analyzing that the area median income for households, it's called CHAS data. It's put out by HUD, and the most recent year available is 2019, and it's a rolling 5-year average. So even having these numbers up isn't fully accurate because the CHAS data it's like I said, based on a 5-year average. But the 2019 figures are what we have available. So I just wanted to give some context about what that means for that area median income when you're thinking of 30%. So we are looking at, we don't really have data on hand yet for some of those other at risk of homelessness, but the one that we have really started to take a deep look at is those with those extremely low incomes, just to have a sense of kind of, okay, in theory, if all of those households that had very low incomes at or below 30%, if they also had no support systems and met other requirements, how many households are we talking about that fall into that category? So that owners and renters total nearly 12% of households in Barnstable County have that income at or below 30% AMI. So it's broken down by owners and renters as well. It's obviously, it's much more likely for a renter household to have that extremely low income, but it's of course seen with homeowners as well, especially someone who might be retired, living on a fixed income. Technically their income may be very low, but they also may have their home paid off. It's a bit of a different situation than a renter who's continuing to pay rent every month. So, sure.
That number based on people who have returns?
No, so that's a really good question, because one important thing to understand here is this is all based on estimates. So that CHAS data I mentioned is based on something called the American Community Survey, which is a census program, but it's not quite as precise as the census, because the census is done every 10 years on a much more precise sampling method. American Community Survey, basically every month the Bureau of the Census surveys X amount of households across the nation, and then they put out new data annually based on that 5-year average I was mentioning. So, but they acknowledge that the margin of error is wider on American Community Survey than it is for the census. Unfortunately, the census, since it may have been 2000 was the last census where they surveyed on income. Now you can only get that information from American Community Survey. So just know, if you're searching like area median income or something, even though it's on census.gov, it's not the decennial census anymore that's reporting that. It's American Community Survey, which is a program of the census, but there is an important distinction there, because it's based on estimates based on that survey system. That is a very good question, because that's an important caveat. So then the third qualifying population, the one that is going to be harder to get precise data on, just because of the very confidential nature of programs that serve people in these situations, but people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. So again, all of these terms are defined in other HUD programs, and they're all paragraphs long. So I will say that for the first several there, the domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, those grouped together are defined under HUD program requirements that relate to providing housing and services to people in those populations. Human trafficking, it includes both sex and labor trafficking, and that definition is coming from what's called the Traffic Victims Protection Act of 2000. So this Hallmark is using those same definitions. And so essentially the data that we have, we're still working on gathering all the data we can about this particular qualifying population, but it's understandably, like I said, very sensitive and confidential. What I can tell you is that according to what's the COC data, there are only 13 shelter beds in Barnstable County, and actually Cape and Islands, that are specifically dedicated to victims of domestic violence. And so we know that. It doesn't mean that other victims of domestic violence can't be sheltered somewhere else. It's just that in terms of a particular program that's really designed to meet their needs and keep them safe, there's only 13 shelter beds. And just to give some context about how there's clearly a gap there in need, from the calendar year from July 2021 to June 2022, there were reported, and this is how it's self-reported, it could be higher, it could be lower, probably higher, 106 victims fleeing domestic violence counted in that Cape and Islands homeless management information system. So you have 13 beds, 106 who are reporting that they are fleeing domestic violence in that year. And then the other populations, this is the one that I want to kind of carefully define because it seems, it seems pretty broad. So I just kind of want to give some guidelines there. So there's kind of two overarching household types that this applies to. Households who have previously been homeless and they are currently housed due to temporary or emergency assistance, or households who either have an annual income, again, of that 30% or less AMI, and they are severely cost burdened. So what that means is they're paying 50% or more of that very low income toward housing. And the other stipulation is you can also have an annual income of 50% AMI or less and meet some other program requirements. Again, those things like overcrowding or moving twice within a 60-day period, and some other eligibility requirements. So that's who's considered kind of the other populations who are also at risk. And so the data that we have on that, I wanted to show for the households for that 30% and then also that 50%, kind of what numbers you're looking at there. So one of the interesting things that I always find so fascinating to point out is that the percentage of households that are, I wonder if I can make the mouse, yeah. So the percentage of households that are extremely low income and severely cost burdened, it's higher among owners than renters. And that's because there are more, even though there's very limited rental in the Cape, there of the rentals that there are housing authority properties and whatnot, there are programs to serve those people, not enough, but it exists. So you often see that it's actually a little bit lower of renters that are severely cost burdened among that extremely low income bracket. But then once you get out of that, it shifts, and it's usually the renters that are much more likely to be severely cost burdened. So when you're looking at that owners and renters that are severely cost burdened and below 30%, that's 7.4% of the households. The other thing I wanted to talk about, veterans and their families. Again, it's a little tricky because you still have to be a member of another qualifying population, so you almost kind of wonder why are they even calling this out? But one of the things that a participating jurisdiction can do is have what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, preferences, yeah. So they can have preferences among the qualifying populations, and you can elevate veterans in that preferences criteria. So that's really the only way it seems to be applicable. But I just wanted to give some veteran statistics. Looking kind of by sub-region and for the county. So one of the interesting things that we noticed when looking at ages in the Outer Cape, the percentage of veterans under 65 goes up quite a bit compared to the other sub-regions. So for Barnstable County, the total percentage of the civilian population over age 18 who are veterans, it's almost 9%. Compared to the state, which is 5.3%, it's considerably higher in the Cape. So we just wanted to give you kind of that understanding of those qualifying populations and the needs that we're currently seeing, because it might help answer some of the questions that we're going to talk about tonight. I did want to give a little sense of the project timeline. So right now we are wrapping up our community meetings. We're going to have a survey launching most likely the end of this week, so stay tuned for information on that. And then we're moving into phase 3, which is really us developing that needs assessment. So some of the things I talked about tonight will obviously be in that needs assessment, and it'll go in greater detail as well, really looking at kind of the demographics of those qualifying populations, and then where the gaps are in terms of, you know, what's available to assist these populations, because that will help determine how the county should allocate across those eligible activities. And then we are hoping to have that draft plan towards the end of the year, and have a public hearing and a comment period. A minimum of 15 days is required for the comment period. And then we submit it to HUD. Should they give comments back, I believe they have 45 days to give comments, and then, you know, the county would revise the plan according to HUD's comments. So why are you here? Well, first of all, I'm so glad that so many people attended tonight. This is great. But really, we want to hear information from you, maybe a variety of backgrounds here. Unlike our consultation interviews, which were very targeted towards certain types of service providers and, you know, that sort of, you know, entity, people who are providing assistance to qualifying populations, these community consultation meetings are really intended to get kind of a lot of feedback from a general audience. We also want to hear your perspectives about which of those eligible activities make the most sense for Barnstable County in terms of assisting those qualifying populations, and hearing any of that observational data from you. You know, we can look at that information from the census, from American Community Survey, from the continuum of care, but, you know, none of it is going to tell the full picture. Getting to talk to people is really incredibly helpful for helping us understand where we need to look further. And then we also would love to hear about any activities, groups, organizations that are already doing this work that Home ARP can build on. So we want to learn from you about that as well. So first I'll just start and see if anyone has questions. I know that was a lengthy presentation, so if you have any questions, Fiona and I will try our best to answer them. And
Do you have a mic here that?
yes.
So the key boxes folks can.
Yes, so if anyone speaks, we're going to ask you to speak into that mic. You won't hear yourself being projected, but it matters for the cable access. It is on?
Oh, thank you. I think I just actually, sorry, everyone. Yes, I know. All right, so does anyone have any questions?
Thought I could just talk loud. How are you reaching out to the populations?
It is, yeah, you won't be able to hear yourself, but it's being recorded.
Good, I like it that way. How are you reaching out to the populations that don't traditionally come to meetings? Some people, really people who don't.
Mm-hmm. So that is a challenge for any public participation process that we are trying to do as much as we can on. One of the things that we're doing in talking to those service providers, we've been speaking with them, you know, for the past 3 weeks, is asking them specifically, can you help us, you know, connect with the people that you work with? Because to be honest, you know, in our experience, someone who is, you know, a member of those qualifying populations, they're more likely to feel comfortable working with or talking to someone that they already connect with, not us outside consultants. And so we've gotten some of, you know, talk to the shelters, talk to other service providers about helping with survey distribution. We have a survey that the survey is going to be available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, in other languages upon request. But that's one of the things that makes this work tricky is we have to lean on the service providers and the people who work with people in need. And a lot of times, you know, one of the things that we've heard is that more so for some of the qualifying populations, there isn't always the trust or desire. And that's challenging and something we're always willing to get input on from someone who has ideas and thoughts. But currently, that's our approach, is really working with those agencies and whatnot to help disseminate information, make sure they can take the survey, and that's what we're doing.
You haven't had it.
No.
Maybe that could be remedied with a reporting system and a 1-800 number that people could call into to report somebody that they suspect is honest. But that way you could have more of an outreach program where that might be more successful.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I was just going to say, can you write that down? That's a great idea. I hadn't heard of that. It's probably something we could do with resources we have, like Google Phone and things like that.
Area. So we do experience homelessness, and of course, then we have violent homeless as well. And my son has from them, and this is very personal.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any other questions?
I just have a clarifying question about resources. The grant that we're discussing is for $1.56 million and is to be divided amongst 10 towns?
Well, 15, but so it's not that it gets divided among them. What will happen when the county receives the funds, there'll be an application process, and like same with regular home funds or with the ARPA funds, agencies and communities can apply for those funds toward the different eligible activities. So
But
yeah.
If they were divided equally, it'd be approximately $100,000
Yeah.
per town.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the program tries to emphasize kind of more the infrastructure rather than, they limit the operating costs and capacity building for nonprofits to that 10%, because I don't think the intention is for it to go toward that, because it's a one-time funding source. And that's one of the tricky things to consider also, because if it goes towards, say, a non-congregate shelter, it can't fund the operating costs for that non-congregate shelter. So, there has to really be a plan in place. And while the county hasn't gotten to the point where, they're developing applications for each of the eligible activities, I think those would be the sorts of things that, is there a plan for how this activity would be continued, and so on and so forth. So yes, it is not a lot of funds.
Yeah, and that's why we also encourage applicants to really try and leverage additional resources when applying for these funds to forward their programs.
Alexis, not a question, but do you want to just inform the folks too on the time frames that we have in terms of when these funds have to be spent?
Oh, yes, thank you. So the funds have to be expended by September 30th, 2030. So ideally, the plan gets approved quickly by HUD, because once the plan is approved, the county has the funds, and then the application process can begin. But so that is,
Yeah, there's a timely expenditure requirement with these funds, so it seems like 2030, you have time, but when it comes time to actually approving the plan and rolling out activities, it can be a tough deadline to meet.
So now I'm confused. So the towns have to apply. So you're developing a plan for what then?
good question. So HUD requires before HUD will even give these PJs the funds, they want a plan that determines of those eligible activities, what percentage the county proposes to allocate toward rental housing, and so it's based on the community consultation process, consulting with those required consultation agencies that I mentioned, and the needs assessment and gaps analysis. So that is where there's just like number crunching. There's a lot of this qualifying population and not a lot of resources. So how should the funds be allocated according to that? So that's what this plan is. It's called an allocation plan because it's really just how the county proposes to allocate the funds.
I could ultimately, come back and say you need to do more, go beyond, talk to more people, et cetera, and the revision time is some turnaround there too, so, hopefully that doesn't happen.
I also think that people might be missing the fact that the county already has $41 million that was given to them already, and a lot of that money is going to be used for housing. So this is in addition to, correct me if I'm wrong, the 41 million that already came to the county.
Yes, these are separate funds, and these funds are very, very specific into what they can be used for and the populations that they're intended to serve. Yes.
This question will demonstrate my ignorance, but one hears about people living in cars, especially for some reason outside of Walmart, and living in tents in the woods. It seems to me that those are such urgent situations, and I'm a little worried about all of the bureaucracy that stands between helping those people and doing whatever you have to do to get these monies. I don't even know if we know who those people are.
Yeah, and it's certainly not a perfect program, and, you know, I don't really have an answer for that. I appreciate the comment, but I understand.
They could be undercounted.
Right,
That could be
right, they're not, they're,
population
exactly,
of homeless.
exactly. Many of those numbers are, that's why that pit count that I talked about is very likely very under counting.
I just wanted to make a comment more for the audience to understand some of what's happening in Falmouth in response to, do we know who these folks are? My name is Susie Hoffman, I'm the Director of Human Services for the town, and there's a number of members here of a network that, of professional homeless serving agencies that meets regularly every other week, and case conferences and identifies who the folks are out in our community that are either in their cars or in tents or at risk of homelessness. And there's a great deal of coordinated work happening to get folks in the right lanes, so to speak, to receive the services. There's not enough shelter beds, emergency shelter, there's not enough transitional housing beds. Excuse me, but there's a great deal of outreach effort and work being done with some of those vulnerable residents in the community. And if anyone, I think we have a pretty good sense of where they are, but often folks can call the Human Services Department, and maybe there's someone that we don't know, so sometimes those Good Samaritan calls are helpful for us, because we can kind of dispatch someone from our team to go out and see where they're at. But just to let folks know that there's a group that meets regularly on that. Sorry to divert from your attention, but I thought it was great. Thank you for that. Anyone else have any other questions?
Okay. So we have some questions that I think have already been answered a bit through your questions, which is great. But our first general question, pretty broad, is if you could tell us a little bit about those qualifying populations that we referred to, so those who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, fleeing domestic violence, who's experiencing the most significant need, who's most at risk, and one thing that would be really helpful to understand as well, because we've heard different things across different communities, is what you perceive as kind of being unique to the Upper Cape. Yes, sorry. So who's experiencing the most need? Yes, and then Fiona, I don't, you know what?
I'll write down the notes.
Okay, the microphone. This is,
Oh, yes.
we need a third person.
Sorry. Thanks. You want me to do the microphone?
Oh, that would be
Okay.
great.
Well, my name is Tim Regan. I am the Assistant Director of Homeless Individual Services for Housing Assistance Corporation. So a lot of this data information, especially the PIC count, our organization, in conjunction with Susie's and Gina's over here and others, we're collecting this data as we go. And as you pointed out, the PIC count severely undercounts. The situation is at hand. Just looking at this information here, we did a sort of an internal poll of information based on not one specific point in time, like the point in time count does, but more of a contract year that went from about April 2021 to March of 2022. sorry. And we were looking for specifically this information, so glad I brought this. And, you know, our numbers are not too far off from what the PIC count was, you know, just our team alone. So when I say team, it's just housing assistance alone. It's myself, it's 2 other outreach specialists that are working from Barnstable to Falmouth and other parts of the Cape, primarily Falmouth and Barnstable. We had over 251 individuals just on our caseload from that one period. And that includes a 3-month period where we had to block the caseloads because they were just becoming way too overwhelming for our staff. Our staff can only manage about a 50-person caseload. 251, we were well above our operating number there. But we were seeing some more disturbing trends amongst the populations that we were seeing, and one of them was obviously the elderly that were coming out, people that were over 62 and older. I believe that number year over year went from 70 to 107 by our count, which, you know, is a very vulnerable population. When you're over 62, the physical health really starts to become a factor. So imagine someone who's unsheltered and has to be on oxygen or anything like that. Another disturbing trend we saw was the domestic violence thing. So that's a statistic that was very hard for us to track because a lot of folks are very not comfortable coming forward with that sort of thing. We're not an organization that generally provides that service. We send them to Independence House or whatever other DB service. That number went from 56 to 79. 65 to 90. And that is just individuals that were put into HMIS that identified with domestic violence. Again, probably undercounting on that. And probably one of the most disturbing ones that we saw was folks with developmental disabilities. These are folks that should be DDS clients and receive DDS services, but for unfortunate reasons we're not. We have a sort of internal idea of why that's happening. That number is as high as 80 right now. So that's people that were born with or developed the mental DDS, you know, symptoms or those diagnoses that we know about are not currently receiving services and are homeless. And probably your biggest one right there is how difficult it is for them today. I put it this way, we're trying to track a whole lot of people that we know about and trying to track a whole lot of people that we don't know about for resources that we don't even have. So it's not I'm not trying to paint a grim picture to say that there is really no housing elsewhere. Some of our programs that we run in our division is, you know, voucher programs, program supported housing voucher programs. What we're seeing a lot is the folks that we are working with here absolutely cannot find a unit and lose their vouchers because there's absolutely nothing to do. This is with a voucher that fully pays your rent. So, you know, we have this sort of saying that we can always find someone if they want to work with us in our office. Do intake, we can connect them to everything. Food stamps, social security, mass health insurance, Medicare, get them food, get them clothes, get them ADLs, get them, you know, mental health services, get them the DBS, get them DV services. All that stuff, not a problem. It's the housing aspect. And it's to the point where we're even getting the vouchers, no problem. You just can't get people into those units. That's the biggest hiccup that we find today. That's obviously, with the homeless population, that's the most requested thing. When you come to housing assistance, you want housing assistance. So it's very difficult. I can't explain just how hard it is for somebody that has DV or mental health or developmental or substance use or anything like that to try and navigate our complicated system of housing down here that we ourselves as the providers struggle with. You know, and not to take up too much time here.
No,
but
please.
It really turns a lot of people off from our services because, you know, when we take a call, when we take an intake, or we go out and meet with someone in the woods, a lot of people are looking for that sort of reprieve. They may have all those services already, but if we can't offer them a path to housing, a lot of them are not going to engage in our services and may not make it into the PIC count or make it into HMIS or any of those services. You know, in that case, we have a runaway problem that we're gonna be chasing for years until, you know, something lets up, so. I can end it right there.
Thank you. Can I just ask a question? For the numbers that you provided for that, that time period, were those sheltered, unsheltered, a combination?
That was a combination of everything. That was a combination of everything, unsheltered, motel, even places that HUD doesn't quite think, like, you know, self-payers for motels,
Yep.
people at risk.
Yep.
Anybody that fit HUD's definition of homelessness and that we felt would fit, either they were going to fit HUD or
Yeah.
did fit HUD or they're unstable, so
Okay,
almost all of them did.
okay. All right, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Oh, someone behind with, yeah.
I don't know if you were speaking or just holding the mic. I'm helping.
She's helping with the mic, which is so appreciated.
One other unofficial data point would be that our essential services network that Tim's a part of, in the last fiscal year, we case conferenced 108 unduplicated homeless individuals in Falmouth alone versus the previous year it was 62. So that's our sort of unofficial identifying who's out there. And so unduplicated in the last year was 108, 62 the year before.
Sorry, last year's number was?
Last fiscal year, FY '22 was 108.
Okay.
The previous year was 62.
62.
And can you share any insight about kind of the demographics and if that's shifted, kind of the things that you're seeing?
I would also let Tim and Carol speak to that, and Gina, but
Okay.
I think some of the changes that we noticed is that some of the folks that are in tents are actually working, they're maintaining their jobs and getting to work. There are a number of very medically compromised senior citizens that are living in their cars. And it's complicated and complex too, because some folks, there's a great deal of effort going into offering them certain levels of care, and they're also turning down certain options, so and what else? I pass it to someone else if I want to comment on who we're seeing now. Do you mind if I let one of them know?
I'm with belonging to each other, and we can validate a lot of what Tim is saying. We saw, not this immediate past season, but the season before, the highest cohort in terms of age of people was the 25 to 35. This past year, the highest cohort, 1 out of 3 was over the age of 60. That was in our homes. We're also seeing the developmental disability issue, and mental health issue, very difficult, to connect folks to services, so, and the domestic violence thing. Now that we saw the statistic you said, I realize why so many of the people in our shelters are fleeing domestic violence, and we're not really set up for that.
You said 1 out of 3, I'm sorry?
1 out of 3 was over the age of 60.
I'm with Pat also, and I was just wondering if Tim had any statistics about the number of our folks who are working. Because I'm technically a homelessness prevention case manager, although I would say that 20% of the cases I'm currently working with are homeless. And the majority of those are also employed. So I think that that's somewhat different on the Cape than other places perhaps. And so I was interested in if you have any statistics on that. And just one other little thing I want to throw in, because it's a sidebar I work on in my spare time. There's a significant portion of our Falmouth homeless population that stay in their cars or stay in their tents because their pets are so precious to them. And we are working on an agile team of volunteers to try to find some support and foster care for those such that these folks can take us back.
Oh.
There's another factor that we really should consider, which is that we have a terrible affliction with addiction and substance abuse in Falmouth. And that affects kind of a younger demographic, many of whom are without housing, but are able to find temporary housing on people's couches and so forth. The church I serve host an NA group, and we usually have somewhere between 30 and 50 people every morning who gather as part of that group. Not also say, like, you know, a big issue is that we have a huge population of young people who are recovering from addiction. And as a result, we have somewhere around 45 halfway houses in Falmouth. And some of them are accredited, but not all of them. And so for a lot of folks, that also represents a real vulnerability in terms of long-term housing.
How many halfway houses did you say?
About 45.
Wow.
Yeah, we're the queens of,
Wow.
I just wanted to respond to Helen's question, which is about half of our population, you know, we have 25 in shelter over the summer, or over the winter, about half of those were employed.
All right, thank you.
I want to come back for a second to the Black and brown members of the community and people who don't speak English or have that as a second language, because I think those numbers are not going to be represented in a lot of statistics because they don't seek services for a whole variety of reasons. And you know, I think what we know nationally is that Black and brown people have a much, the percentage of people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness is much higher than the Caucasian population in this country. And I would really like to see more effort put into actually reaching them, because I think we, and I will include myself in it, but I think we do a lot of, well, we couldn't reach them, so moving on. And I think that really does a disservice to a big population of folks here. And I think, you know, in terms of some of those, you know, money going toward operating costs, et cetera, I would love to see a salary differential go to people who speak other languages who are hired. Not that they can find housing either, so, you know, trying to figure out ways that people live there, period. And for people who represent other ethnicities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We also see, hi, I'm Laura Cole from First Congregational Church. We've also seen a number of folks that are transient. So maybe not just Falmouth residents, but come from other places and are seeking assistance. So it's a pretty global problem, but it comes back, and so then they come to Falmouth looking for resource, and we already have limited resource, so that should be considered as well.
Mm-hmm.
I want to explain to you why we have probably more halfway or sober houses than most communities, is because we have the Gosnell Treatment Center here.
Okay.
And so people, a lot of people get their treatment there, and they want to stay in this community because our community has so many services for them. So that is why we have that extraordinary number.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question because, Fiona, I believe we were told there's a meeting at 7, right? I want to make sure. Yeah. So, again, as I pull these questions up, I'm going to realize that you've already answered quite a few of them, but we'd love to hear kind of where you perceive the unmet shelter, housing, and service needs. In particular, one of the things that we've heard a lot in talking in these different consultation interviews was in terms of the services that people might need to stay housed. So getting people into housing is one thing, but then where are the service gaps? Or when people are moving from one shelter experience or into transitional housing or into their next step in their journey, where are the gaps? So I'll start with that. As you can see, there are sub-bullets, but I think that's kind of the general question is where do you see gaps in service delivery? housing and shelter needs?
Again, Laura Cole. I think, and this is not in all cases, but in the folks that I've met with, we're dealing with folks that have had trauma, past trauma, unidentified from maybe young ages or whatever, and then that sometimes leads to substance abuse because of unresolved issue. And then that, unfortunately, goes into the homeless piece of it. So I think that to be proactive, it might behoove us to start looking at the school systems and providing some trauma counseling, as well as adult trauma counseling. And it's something I'm a little passionate about right now.
Thank you. Anybody else want to talk about some of the gaps, either in shelter, housing, or service needs that you see, or the connection between those?
Hi, I'm Nell. One of the things that I see often is that people can find winter rentals and then they get kicked out during the summer. And I'm talking about all populations. It's happening down in the scientific community. And that is, very disruptive, and actually it leads to people, unfortunately, leaving the area.
Yes, that's something we've heard quite a bit as well.
Yeah, I might add that one of the gaps is transitional housing.
Okay.
So we might have shelter beds, but there's nothing in between a shelter bed and permanent housing.
I think there's also a gap for, what's traditionally considered wet shelters, so shelters for people who are not able to be sober or clean.
All right, so kind of on that same note, are there any particular gaps that you see in the context of civil rights, fair housing, or accessibility? Just to kind of start off the conversation, one of the things that we've heard is people who might be voucher holders or receive some tenant-based rental assistance being discriminated against. But that's just one of the things we've heard a lot of. We'd love to hear kind of other instances you may have heard of, either discrimination or in terms of accessibility as well, that make it challenging for people.
I'm too slow here.
Oh.
I think that because there is like zero rentals stock, that as soon as something becomes available, landlords have their pick of whoever they would want to place in their unit, and they can do so without really being discriminatory officially. And they, so it's just again, the lack of housing stock. The folks that we're working with are not the first in line without anything that becomes available.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any feedback on the accessibility issues in the shelter system as well? That's another piece that we'd heard.
You may not be super related to ARPA, but I am not, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the family shelter system. It is horrible. Basically, you have X amount of beds per region, and all family shelter referrals go through the state. So they get sent to a state hotline, usually through DTA, and then they get placed wherever there's a bed. So if you have a homeless family on Cape Cod, they may wind up being in a bed in Worcester or Lowell or Middlesex, and vice versa. You might have someone from Boston come down to Cape Cod. It's a terrible system because maybe you live and work on Cape Cod, you just know a place to go. Well, you want shelter, you go to Boston. I think this inflates our numbers for unsheltered families a lot because, you've got kids that go to school, you've got jobs, you have family down here. A lot of people are turned off by that system because unless you get lucky on a good day, we run the family shelter system, so we know kind of who comes in and out. You are usually sent away to go live somewhere else and receive services. I could rail on it for hours, Michael.
Do you know if it's always, like, has it been that way for a long time?
It
or?
is always full. Oh, I'm sorry. But
Oh,
yes,
yeah, okay,
Yeah,
interrupted.
it's been that way for years. If you call the number, you're gonna get a hotline and it's gonna drop your call.
Or you're gonna be on, not that it's related to this, but, or that family who's experiencing homelessness is going to be on hold for literally hours. You know, I've got people to say, they're picking up their kids at school and then they're still on hold, or then it becomes 5 o'clock and the call gets dropped. So, and again, it's supposed to be emergency shelter, so you call the hotline, you think you're gonna get placed in emergency shelter. And then there's a whole eligibility criteria process that you have to prove your homelessness, and that can take days. So then there's this gap between I'm homeless now, and I have to prove to the state that I'm homeless, and so that leaves me kind of relying really on the communities, the churches and the friends and the schools that put them up while they're navigating that process. And then they could be told, oh, you're just this much over income, I'm sorry. And then they're still homeless.
I think there's also a gap for teenagers who are not with a family and not over 18. I think there's a real gap in that non-congregate housing, which, a lot of traumatized folks can't be sleeping in bunk beds in a room full of people they don't know. And certainly a gap for places where they speak Portuguese, Spanish, other languages.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, gap among teens, transitional housing in the last?
Non-congregate
Non-congregate.
and places where they speak other languages.
Got it, thank you.
And another piece with the family shelter system, we have a significant number of folks I know. I think I have 5 of them who are divorced and have partial custody. And there's absolutely no way for these homeless individuals to be with their children. We believe in fiction. And just one other little thing to talk about, what do our homeless folks need? They need places to charge those cell phones so they can endure those 5 hours of being on hold. And we're working on this one, but they need places to take a shot.
I'm wondering, and Hack, you may have a good perspective on this working throughout the Cape, but anyone, I would love to hear from anyone. Are there particular areas of the Cape where you think the needs differ because of, just proximity to services or anything like that?
We're hearing a lot of folks that are having to travel from outer and lower Cape coming to Hyannis and Falmouth to try and access services. Yeah.
So the 2 hotbed areas that we find is Falmouth and Hyannis. If you are in any other spot on Cape Cod, you're probably going to be heading one way or another to get to either or. Hyannis has the added benefit of having the St. Joseph shelter there, which, is, while they have a cap, it is more likely you're going to go that way. Falmouth does have a good, response, but typically, if we get somebody in Falmouth who goes homeless in Falmouth, we're gonna try and send them to Hyannis to get them to the shelter if they're choosing to be sheltered. We just don't have a shelter down here. I mean, we have some winter protocols that Gina and some of the other programs can house very select few individuals. So Falmouth does have a little bit more. You go from here to Hyannis, so there's nothing. So you're probably going to wind up in either or.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we've heard a lot about how the lack of rental in general makes the problem seem, insurmountable. Are there any other barriers you can think of in the context of the housing market that make it challenging? So quality of housing, we've talked a little bit about barriers to using rental assistance, or other issues concerning accessibility?
Yeah, Laura Cole again. I would say mental health, okay, because if people, some folks could be on a more followed by case, taking medication, that would improve the quality of them maintaining their stability.
Yes,
So that's a huge one.
okay.
You know, in some ways, there's kind of two Cape Cods. My family went back to like the mid-Cape, starting in the late part of the 19th century. And so I've seen this kind of play out. The Cape used to be really working class. You know, there was an industry around fishing, and a lot of those people still live on Cape Cod. And they have homes that they've paid for, but those homes are being shared by more than one generation. And they have seen their taxes go up higher and higher and higher, and so they can barely afford to stay on Cape Cod. And when it comes time to try to sell these homes, because there are so many people invested within the family, it becomes a nightmare. And there are people who are forced to sell their houses because they just can't afford the higher cost of living.
Thank you. All right, any other thoughts on barriers caused by the housing market? I mean, I think it's come up quite a bit in other questions, and I'm glad you mentioned the service gap. That is definitely something we've heard a lot in terms of keeping people housed. So this one, we get a variety of answers on this, kind of depending on who we're speaking with, and I would be curious. So the types and size of units that are needed by those seeking shelter, where's there the greatest need? You know, in terms of, you know, studio, one-bedroom, family, where is the greatest need? Or other housing types?
I really am not trying to be
No, I am so glad you are here tonight.
Yeah, so probably the biggest request is the one bedroom.
Yeah.
Which is, makes sense. You know, you want to have a place to eat, you want to have a place to hang out, you want to have a place to just lay your head. However, most of the folks that we do find housing for will never turn out a studio. So either it's a studio, one bedroom, whatever, it starts to veer off a little bit into when you start to get to like the room rentals. I would say maybe half of our folks would be willing to do that. We kind of put that out there very quickly. And then if you go into a congregate setting, it starts to really fall off a cliff. But it's understandable because that really brings the notion that people most respect their privacy. And absolutely, you know, we want to try and accommodate that. We really want to make that happen. It's just the most private situations require, are some of the most sought after things like Cape Cod. You know, so there's big bloods for one bedrooms. You know, it's kind of like what Laura was referring to. You know, a lot of the folks that are homeless have extra barriers to getting to that one bedroom.
Right.
But you know, when you start getting into more like folks with like substance use, they're a little bit more prone to like silver houses and stuff. You know, so when you get to more sensitive population, DVs. Victims are more likely to go to a DV shelter, even if it's a congregate, so it's used for a sober home, vet housing, that kind of thing. So.
Need a little of everything.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, all right. Thank you. Oh, behind.
That's a hard question to answer because we need housing on every end of this continuum.
Right.
Whether it's affordable homeownership versus emergency shelter. But if, you know, I'm here kind of thinking about the folks that are currently homeless, and I think we need emergency housing beds on the Upper Cape, and I think we need the next step in their transition towards independent living. So emergency shelter, transitional housing. I know there's different names right now, whether it's non-congregate or whatever, but there needs to be something for the folks that are currently homeless that is their first step exiting homelessness. And then there needs to be the next transitional stage, supported housing, that type of thing. And then of course we need more affordable rentals for when they are more advanced in their journey. So you can make that happen.
With 1.5 million.
Yeah.
I agree with what Susan was saying, I think, it really needs to be on the continuum from like tiny houses for individuals up to multifamily homes for people. I think, if somebody asked the question, how many of people live in crowded housing as opposed to whether you're homeless, I think we'd have a whole different, because that's where we'd get several families living together, or
Right.
generations of people living in a two-bedroom,
Yep.
or whatever. And I think that there are a lot of, families where there are generations or relatives or extended family all living together in the same unit, and so some large units that would accommodate people who prefer that living circumstance
Okay.
would also be helpful.
Nell again, yes, no. I would like to see more options for emergency housing, because it's not unusual for us to get somebody banging on the door at 7 p.m., looking, it's raining, it's cold, it's snowing, the BTO houses are full. At that point, we're putting them up in hotels or motels. I love the idea of tiny houses, and I love the idea of shared housing. Can we have a program where we match seniors, homeowners who are having a tough time making payments, tax payments? Can we do a shared housing thing that they do in Sweden and Denmark and places like that?
Yeah, I just want to add on to that too. I think shared and transitional is huge because, especially in the wintertime when you get the bad weather, we have programs where we can put someone up for the night and then it pays for the night. That program last year cost over $1 million.
Yeah.
$1 million I could have probably built transitional housing for a
Or
good
Block
portion of
Hotel.
that. All of it gets just thrown away into just nightly
Yeah.
housing for inclement weather. It's not in winter round.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
It's just a sidebar, I'm so, just, again, if we're talking about developing this kind of thing that's a continuum, again, preventatively, then you're gonna wanna have social work, you're gonna wanna have people there to oversee, so that everything runs smoothly, because then you're putting your money where your mouth is, kind of story. So that would be another caveat to expenditure. You would need that.
This is a side too, but, mobile shower vans is something that's been popular in some parts of the world, and okay, that's all.
I agree 100%.
I want to comment on what Laura said, because I think it's one thing to ask questions and get answers about housing this, but as part of this ecosystem, you can't just have housing without taking care of people's mental health and physical health, and people who have medical needs, just coming out of the hospital, are more at risk to get into homeless situations. So I'm glad we're talking about this, but it's very complex, and all those pieces need to be in play.
Absolutely. So our final question, which I think we just heard quite a bit of input on, in terms of those eligible activities, knowing that it's $1.5 million, and what this plan will do is prescribe kind of a percentage that the county proposes to allocate toward. So the rental housing, again, where 70% of the units that are funded with Hallmark funds need to be for those qualifying populations, tenant-based rental assistance, those supportive services that people need to stay housed, non-congregate shelters, and then that operating assistance and capacity building for nonprofits. Keeping in mind that that last one, again, can only be up to 10% of the total grant. We would just love to hear from you kind of what you think is the biggest priority or priorities that these funds should go toward. Now, I will say, on your agendas, we put what we just call a ticket to leave, where you can just give us some additional comments. If you want to share on that, what your thoughts are, that's fine too, or we can discuss it. I'm happy to keep going. I believe it's just the cable access that they're filming something else at 7, I think. But that doesn't mean we have to stop talking. But, so anyway, so yeah, you can, if you want to write it on that or talk about it. I know it's very hard to answer because, as you said, it's this ecosystem. None of these things exist in a vacuum or can exist in a vacuum. And it's only $1.5 million, which is why we really want to emphasize, building on existing resources and programs and community partners to really get kind of the most mileage out of these funds, because they are just one-time funds.
Because it's such a relatively small amount of money, I think that it needs to go towards acquisition or rehabilitation of some actual physical structures that might be able to provide some of this emergency or non-congregate transitional type housing. It's not enough for that, so it would need to be public-private partnerships with existing housing corporations, pooling town funds, using ARP funds to see, what's that? County funds. County fund, yeah, so, and then determining, again, it's regionally, like where across the region do we need that type of housing, and encouraging each sub-region to, pool resources with all those organizations.
I think if someone gave me $100,000 and said you could spend it on one project, I would probably use it to convert some of the showers that we have in town to be used by people year-round. We have a number of facilities right on beaches that are already capable of providing showers, but they're seasonal. And the truth is, if you have someone who is unemployed or hoping to change their circumstance, one of the things they need is a shower. You can't apply for a job unless you have had a shower, unless you feel good about yourself and look good. There's no excuse for us not to have showers available.
I might add laundry to that.
And laundry facilities too, absolutely.
I think that's particularly tricky because it's something that we've heard, and thinking of it in the context of these buckets, I'm trying to think of, because the supportive services, there's a whole long list of what is considered a supportive service. Non-congregate shelters, again, it's very specific. I think the only thing I could possibly see that falling under would be if it's like, a non, yeah.
Is going toward that operating assistance.
I absolutely agree. It's just trying to think in terms of these.
Or if you take over a hotel and make it non-congregate housing that has laundry facilities and
that others can access.
Showers in it.
I like the way you think. That's, yeah.
Well, speaking of buckets, there's a real need for a creative use of water for this population, so, I'm sorry. I said, when we're speaking of buckets, there's just a tremendous need for the creative use of water for washing people in clothing. And just reminding that so many of our folks are employed, and their number one stressor is, where do I get a shower before I report to work in the food service industry?
Does anyone else want to share their thoughts on these? I believe that's our last question, and then we just wanted to kind of give project updates. I could be wrong. Maybe there's a question 6. In terms of the existing and anticipated resources available to meet these needs that the money may enhance, I think we've talked about partnering with, communities pooling resources together. Some of the uses like the rental housing, that could also be something where CPA funds could probably be used to supplement. Kind of getting creative there. Does anyone else have anything that they want to add that maybe hasn't come up in conversations? Oh, yeah.
think most of the people here are already affiliated with some organization or not. I represent the unaffiliated people. And I'm wondering whether there's an effort to make use of us. Some of us might have some special skills, like maybe we're retired mental health workers or drug abuse counselors. Some of us are just able to, are ready to volunteer to do whatever is needed, like passing the microphone. And some might be able to make financial contributions. I don't actually know how I discovered this meeting, but I'm not sure. I think that there are lots of other people in this community who would be here if they knew there was something they could do to help.
Thank you.
I would just like to make a comment. I'm an observer on all this. And how would you like to come into your friend's kitchen door, and she's getting off the phone and she's all happy. And I said, well, what are you so happy about? And she says, well, David finally got a place to live. And I said, well, that's great. And she said, yes. Says, 2 hours later, the phone rings, and she goes, oh. So then you ask her, well, what happened? And you say, well, Johnny just took Charlie's place. And this is what it's like for these people. You've got 50 cases and 1 person. The odds aren't really good at all. I'm sorry.
Oh, I keep having more questions than I realized. I think we will just go over the next steps, because we want to make sure, one of the things that we've heard is that I am kind of curious where people who are here heard about this meeting. I mean, I can tell you where we in the county circulated information, but we would love to know where else you think might be a good way to get the word out about other upcoming project opportunities and steps. And, if you're also willing to help get the word out, just really, I know that's kind of a mouthful there, but if on your ticket to leave, if you want to indicate anything like that as well, other ideas, suggestions for getting the word out, how did you hear about this? We'd like to know kind of what worked and what didn't, because I agree, I think more people probably would be involved if they knew about it, knew more about the program. I mean, sometimes we've also heard people who are just, they're confused. They think it's the ARPA funds that the county is also managing right now. And so, any kind of messaging advice, we will gladly take it. So for those kind of next steps coming up, we're doing these 4 regional, sub-regional public meetings right now. So tomorrow, I'll be in Provincetown. Fiona will be in Barnstable doing this meeting again. And then we will be launching, like I said, that survey. We have connected with various partners to help make sure that it gets to a very wide audience, ideally including qualifying populations. And then when the draft plan, like I said, there will be a public hearing as well and a comment period on that as well. So that's kind of what's next. There is a project page. We tried to make it simple. It's just tinyurl.com/Barnstable County Home-ARP. But we also have that QR code available on the poster right outside the room. If you scan it, it'll take you right there. You can also just get to it through the county website. It just was a very long URL. So, but Renee Hammond, again, she's the home program manager, so she also is happy to take comments from you as well. And so that's our contact information. And I believe Fiona was more prepared than me and has her cards as well. So, but so if anyone else has any questions or comments, we'll be here if you want to chat for a minute. But again, if you wanted to leave any written comments, you can just leave them up front. And we really appreciate it, and we really appreciate you coming here. And I'm happy to see that there are service providers that, how many of you here are representing here kind of in your role from an organization?
Yay. Our survey is coming up.
Yeah, so we have two versions of the survey. One is for your perspective as a service provider, and then there's a general public one as well. I mean, you're welcome to take both, but yeah.
Great.
Yes. So thank you so much, everybody. Well, this is our first full one.